Our next speaker is Jess Goyder, who has not only learnt to live with ME and CFS, but has learnt to make the very most of what life has to offer. Marcus Aurelius said that there is nothing that nothing external that pains you, but it's your own thoughts that make it so. And Jess is really living proof of this maxim.
It's January 2016, and I can't get off the sofa. I caught a virus about 3 weeks ago in India, so I'm not really thinking too much about it. But it's a bit strange because it feels like I've been zapped by kryptonite. And it's like the plug's been pulled on my body. And I just about managed to call my sister, and I stay frozen on the sofa for 2 hours until she can come round and rescue me. And things don't get much better. I start to wake up in the mornings feeling like I've been buried alive. And it's bad luck that 2 friends die, one after the other. And I shuffle around the house, only just about able to move around and make cups of tea. And I think this is what it must feel like to be really, really old. Finally, 8 months later, I was diagnosed. And I was so grateful to have a name because that was on a doorway out. But it's a crap name. It's chronic fatigue syndrome. Some doctors say calling chronic fatigue syndrome what it is a bit like calling arthritis achy joint syndrome. It's also known as ME, or myalgic encephalomyelitis, and it's a neuroimmune condition that can largely affect the nervous system, though it affects most systems of the body. And the reality of ME for many people looks like this. Many people are pretty much bedbound. Maybe you might have to have the curtains closed and you can't be hugged because you're so light and touch sensitive. There are many other people who are leading more normal lives. There's a spectrum. I think what everyone has in common is that recovery is not straightforward. Nobody quite expects recovery from an illness to be this straightforward, but reality is messy, slow, boring, and painful, and a trudge. And it's all over the place. It looks a bit more like that. In June 2017, I was using mobility scooters. I'd seen a consultant. I still couldn't really hold my head up. My body ached. My brain was pretty fuzzy. And I had quite a dark depression I couldn't shake. And the consultant said, Jess, you really need to accept that there is no cure. And I'm so grateful he told me that, because that's the moment I had this quiet voice inside my head simply say, you're wrong. And we'll fast forward a year to 2018, quite recently. And I'm swimming front crawl in almost every body of water I can get myself into. I feel pretty well. My brain is back. I'm fresh. And I've just come back. I'm on my way back home from a round the world trip. And I've had the best 5 months of my life. Rich and brilliant. This isn't a straightforward story at all. And I don't want to even begin to imply that what I'm about to talk about is enough, because medically what I did would be a 3-hour talk, and I'm still working on it. But what I am going to talk about today is what I found on that journey from that sofa and those mobility scooters to where I am today. What wisdom in that would be relevant to anybody? What would I have wanted to have known before all this had happened? So I'm going to call it my 5 key principles of wisdom from ME. So, the first key principle. You're going to hear it all day. And there are no revelations here. It's to give your body what it needs. Because giving your body what it needs has a powerful effect on your nervous system. let your body know that you've got its back. And it's with the basics, as Nikki said, it's choosing in every moment. Do you need a glass of water? Do you need to move around? Do you need to do some exercise? Do you need to absolutely not go out tonight? Do you need to just stop for a moment? My top tip and my pledge, because it's something I stopped doing recently, is a sleep meditation called Yoga Nidra. And the tricky part is that I have to lie down in the middle of every day. And I have to be incredibly strict about that. But I find if I can lie down in the middle of every day for about 20 minutes, and I listen to a recording, which is a body scan, it's the equivalent of about 2 hours sleep, and it supercharges me for the rest of the day. So it's a bit hardcore. I know you've got work to do and other things, but if you can actually manage to do that, I think you might find it really making a difference, because that's the only way I can completely switch off and rest and feel my body restoring itself. Oh, I should be on a cat. This is the rest part. There's the wider question about the architecture of your life and how it supports your health. I didn't have a lot of say in this because I lost my job, I was bedbound and I couldn't work and I had no social life. And my family came and moved me out of my flat in London, and yes, they had to look after me in Childbury. And actually, I don't think I've talked about what my life looked like, did I, before I fell ill, because that's a really important thing to not miss. So what my life looked like was that I lived in London. I taught at an international school part-time. I was pretty organised and responsible. I helped students through their UCAS applications, but that was a part-time job. My life was really about singing and music, and I was a professional singer-songwriter. I played piano and guitar, and I was pretty healthy because I needed to protect my voice. I went out to a lot of music industry events. I had a lot of fun. I did spend far too long I was always on the go. I did check emails late at night. I spent far too long on the tube. But I was fundamentally quite healthy. I did lots of exercise and I did yoga and meditation. I thought I was one of the healthy people because everything was about protecting my voice. So in my new life, I had to reduce life down to its barest essentials, because I was choosing between, well, shall I have a shower today or shall I make my own breakfast? It was that stark. And in those moments, life boiled down to three things. In my case, it was my family and friends and my relationships, my loved ones. It was about my health, obviously, because that was my full-time job and all I wanted was to get my body back. And in my case, the third thing was nature, because I found myself craving the wilderness. And I think I craved the wilderness because for me it was about stopping and reconnecting with something I had lost, maybe all that time in London, maybe all that time in bed. But I had this wild conviction that the wilderness could heal. And I started to think, how could I make that happen? And I started to think, well, if I was well, what would be the thing I would most want to do right now? And I thought up the round the world trip. I didn't have anything to prove, it was just the most outrageously fun thing I could think of doing. And so I did whatever I needed to do to make it happen. I don't want you to think I fell into a giant vat of money, because that's not the case. I had friends in Australia and the States, and my sister had moved to New Zealand, and I worked out that if I was frugal, I could make it happen. So the message is, don't wait. If I can do it with ME, you can do it at any time. And so, my next one is to let go of striving. I had never been mega famous, but I'd done some good things with my music. I had toured Canada and South America, played about 10 Glastonburys. I was working with Aretha Franklin's producer around the time I got ill, well, one of them, because she had a lot of producers. And my life was all about and dedicated to the orchestra parts and melodies and songs that I had in my head and transposing them into reality in concerts and in recordings, and that was the thing I absolutely lived for. And an interesting thing happened in the course of my illness. I completely lost the ability to sing. And I spent months and months trying. Day after day, I'd sit at the piano and it wouldn't be there. and it was heartbreaking. And I'd wait for a week, I'd wait for a week, wait for a month, go back again. Until I realised I had to accept that I needed to let my music go. I couldn't even record. And there was a deep reason why I had to let this go. There was nothing wrong in what had driven me, and it had been and still is a pure and beautiful thing. But there was a part of me that no level of success would ever have been enough for. It was a bit of a bottomless pit, and I was always chasing after something. So I'm not saying don't be ambitious and don't work hard. I think it's the idea that what you do out in the world is an expression of how full you are, rather than something you're trying to chase after or to fill a gap. And perhaps the antidote to striving, for want of a less cheesy word, is self-love. To love yourself enough just to stop and be half good enough, because you're good enough just as you are. And I still have to let go of striving every moment, because your determination is turned inside out with ME. I recovered partly by saying I could walk that 500 metres. It would be an effort, but I could do it, of course. But if I want to get better, it's vital that I don't even start to try. I have to sit here. And the next piece of wisdom is to let yourself feel what you feel. Nikki touched on this. It's not about wallowing, but of course I was ambushed. Well, maybe not of course, but I was ambushed by grief as I let go of my career. I thought you grieve for people. But I was naturally quite deliberate about this. And I also felt huge surges of anger. And actually that anger and I were really good friends. There were not words blasphemous enough to describe how I felt, but it was good. It powered me through. It was like my rocket fuel. And I guess the idea is that if you're feeling something, and maybe you'd rather not feel it, if you'd like to feel something different, whatever it is, whatever the answer you're hoping for, the only way is through. And the next thing is to connect. It's very, very isolating being ill. And it's very easy to get self-absorbed and very self-obsessed. All you can think about sometimes is your body and your illness. And I vanished from my life for about 10 months. People didn't even know what had happened. And I thought, well, the easiest thing to do is just to write it all down and send it out there. So I wrote a blog. Started writing a blog called my ME CFS Diary, Needing to Run While Being Sat On by a Bear. And I just wrote everything down about ME, about what had happened, what I'd learnt, and it had much more of a response than I thought it would. And I still hear from people with ME, and I'm still writing it, and people say it's helping them. And writing has got me through. I think writing's become my voice, and I still do it nearly every day. And the next thing is that I found Dorothy. Dorothy has very severe dementia, and I was asked to look after her for a couple of hours in the afternoons while her carers have a nap. And sometimes it was pretty easy, because I would open the door and I would have a little nap next to her while she had her nap. I got paid to sleep. And at that point I'd just been saying, please find me something I can do rather than just lying here. And some days were more challenging. Some days Dorothy would be locked in quite a traumatised or anxious episode, and I'd open the door and there would be shoes and fruit bowls in strange places. And my job was to make her feel better. And so we'd go out, and Dorothy liked to spy on people, and we tried to climb trees, and she had this habit of drinking directly out of the spout of the teapot in the local coffee shop. And Dorothy taught me two things. She taught me, firstly, to be more present, because Dorothy can't finish her sentences, and my job was to meet her wherever she was inside of each unfinished sentence. And the next thing, of course, was how lucky I was, because Dorothy's mind is unravelling and she's in a home now, and I have my whole life ahead of me. On to the next thing is to choose your response. I'm running out of time.
You've got 6 minutes left.
Okay, well, I think this is major, because this is the one thing you can control. One way of looking at my situation was that I was stuck in bed in Childbury and my life had fallen apart. I was a bit like a car that had been impounded and the wheels had been taken off me. Another way of looking at things was that the only reason I had been impounded was that I was getting a new engine and a much better steering wheel, better brakes, definitely, a new paint job, leather upholstery, and new tyres. And because cars are computers these days, let's say a new operating system. Because at this time, I was working through the body, I was working through every major system of the body that I could, using natural medicine, I was researching, I was actually getting quite well, if you looked at things from one direction. And I was also exploring hypnosis and the imagination and what my mind was capable of doing, and the subconscious, which was fascinating to me. And I quite naturally imagined myself doing the thing that I most missed doing, most of all in the whole world, and that was climbing a mountain. So I kept imagining it, climbing a mountain, climbing. And I didn't only see it, I felt the wind in my hair, my heart banging in my chest. And I felt myself jumping into a pool of cold water underneath a waterfall. And I kept seeing those things again in my head. And gradually I made progress until I was able to walk 6 kilometres. And my physio discharged me and said, Jess, climbing a mountain is a proper target for you now. And the trip came together. But of course, nothing went quite as we expected. I hadn't wanted to admit to anybody as I left the country that my mobility was slipping. And at Heathrow Airport, I crashed. And a crash is when it's really hard to put one foot in front of the other. And I always seem to get desperately upset. I think it's the exhaustion. It's such a deep feeling of exhaustion, a bit like your cells have cut out. And you just feel so disappointed. It's like you're back to square one. And so I was bundled into a wheelchair and only just made a flight to Dubai. And as the plane took off, I thought, what the hell am I doing? And it wasn't an easy trip. I was bedbound a lot in Australia and promised that I would do everything I could that I had done last time to get better. I would give my body what it needed. And I would also have the best time I could have within those limitations. So this is with my family in New Zealand, and when I couldn't walk to this lake from the car where this photo was taken, I started using a Fitbit to calculate my steps so that a few days later, if I did much less the rest of the day, I could still walk to the lake and have a little swim. This is me hitchhiking, not my finest hour. Well, it's very safe to hitchhike in New Zealand. I had this thought that I would go to this yoga centre I had always dreamed of getting to. And I was doing quite badly, and I promised everybody that I would come home if things didn't get any better. And I was actually okay with that. I didn't have anything to prove. But the idea was to get to this yoga centre because I had such a strong feeling I needed to get there. And on the way, I was travelling by myself, I needed a lot of help. I couldn't even carry my backpack for most of this trip. Strangers carried that pack the whole journey. I'd had a crash by the time this photo was taken at 9 in the morning. But all of these people helped me get to my destination, from Picton to Nelson. A PE teacher on a break, and this couple at the end here who were on their first date and they're still together. And eventually I got to Anahata, which is a yoga retreat on South Island. And I found an amazing community there and learnt practices like Yoga Nidra. I learnt to really be more present, because I was still very driven. Even when I got there, I had this idea that, well, there was a waterfall half an hour's walk away, and by the end of my stay, I will be walking to the waterfall. And I kept seeing it. And I learned that actually what was important was to be more present. And that, okay, I can't climb a mountain, but I'm living on top of a mountain. This was where I lay my head down at night, looking out over Golden Bay. And as I stayed more present moment by moment and really saw things as they were, without getting lost in thought, I did a silent retreat for a very long time. Life was really simplified again. I just needed to make things as simple as possible. And there was always something tiny and miraculous in front of me, right under my nose. And if I stayed in each moment, there was nothing that I couldn't get through, until I was well enough to carry on with the rest of my trip. And so I went to the South Pacific, and I crashed in a supermarket, and it took about 10 days to recover. But I flew to the second island called Atutaki in the Cook Islands. And, oh, wrong way. And I felt myself being charged up by life force. It was that this place I had dreamed of really was giving my body something very, very powerful. I can't explain. And I swam with crazy tropical fish. I lived in a beach hut. I made lovely friends that I'm still in touch with. And I flew to LA a few weeks later and was fine. Really complicated journey and was fine. And by the time I landed, I was in Colorado for 2 weeks, took myself on a road trip into the Rockies. And a friend said, Jess, if you hadn't told us that you were ill, we wouldn't have known the difference. And this was when I really felt my mind coming back to me, that my brain was back, that maybe I could start to think about work again. And finally, I made it to New Hampshire, where I've got 2 really old friends. And his wife has ME, so he knew exactly what to do. He was like, Jess, you need a boiled egg. I was like, oh, thanks, okay. I was in the car with them one day and blurted out, I climbed a mountain. Because I had just climbed a mountain. I climbed Mount Kearsarge. It had been a half-hour climb up. I'd almost ran up it, my heart banging in my chest, the wind in my hair. And 20 minutes down, I was absolutely fine. And I realised that 2 days beforehand, I had been swimming in my little pool under the waterfall in that dappled light. And this is it. The waterfall's just behind that rock, the sculptured rocks. So I'd found my waterfall and my mountain. And I guess back to one point of this story is to not wait to do something that you've always wanted to do. Don't wait to live. And certainly don't wait until something like this happens until you really start living and giving your body what it needs. Oops. So just to go over those one last time, give your body what it needs. Let go of striving. Let yourself feel what you're actually feeling right now. Connect with everyone around you, the world, nature, and really importantly yourself. And finally, choose your response, because it's the only thing you can control. And while I keep doing these things, I may have ME, but it will never have me.
I've spoken to you before about my brother's girlfriend who has chronic fatigue, and she's in her early 30s at the moment, so this is sort of the prime of her life, and she's in a bed at the moment, and I just want to know what sort of advice when someone's that low, that can't move, and your thoughts catch up with you, and you can get into a serious depression. You know, how do you get that first initial step in the right direction to where you are now?
It's really hard. I think you need, the problem with ME is the body is usually locked in a flight or flight response, and you can't actually get into the healing state that you need to get into. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I think firstly, stabilise your activity. So if she can't get out of bed, she actually needs to really make sure she doesn't try to do more than she's capable of. And I think for me, natural medicine was vital, because I had to start actually working systematically through the body on what actually I could control, and the gut was fundamental. So everything Julia talked about, the gut and digestion, start with that. Start with the basics, so you know that the body is digesting food properly. I would do whatever you could to rest the mind. It's really hard. I mean, it's hard to really give advice, because you do lose your life, you lose your identity in the way you show up in the world. And I guess actually the point of my talk was that I've had to learn to make my health and my body more important than how I show up in the world and my identity. And I think, ME, you have to let go of that. And for me, that was an absolute blessing. But it's really hard. There are no easy answers. But I would start with stabilising activity. I would, counselling is very good. EMDR therapy was amazing for me, absolutely amazing. Eye movement, desensitisation, reprocessing. And it's actually used in PTSD, and it was brilliant for me, but it's exhausting, so it should come at a later stage. So in ME there are lots of stages, so I think she's in the crash stage where she can't move, and that's really, really hard. There's no, there are no easy answers for getting through it, but I can talk to you more about where she needs to start, I think.
Thank you. Unfortunately,
We're out of time.
Thank you.